Thank you very much. Thank you, John, for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here. I have a connection to Austria because my wife's grandmother was born in Austria, and she came after the First World War and came to Statue of Liberty in 1919 or something like this. And so my mother-in-law grew up in New Jersey speaking only German until she was 6 years old. So my wife has kept in touch with all her relatives in Austria. So that's the Austrian connection that I have. What I thought I would do is to just go through a history of how some of the most impactful innovation ecosystem started and some of the opportunities and challenges, and then move into the future about some of the challenges we face with technology, the positive and negative side of science, innovation, and technology, and how policy plays an important role. In particular, I want to highlight that leadership matters. Leaders of countries, leaders of organizations play an important role in changing the course of science, changing the course of history in impactful ways. So we'll go through, that's why the history part of is quite, even though it's obvious, it's good to look at some data points in that regard. And then I'll finish off with some demographic trends and future directions, which are somewhat surprising sometimes. So let me first start with this slide. So we take all the innovations from the last more than 100 years, and we want to ask the question, how long did it take from the time a product was created to the time the first 50 million people used it around the world? So what is the time taken to reach 50 million customers on a global scale in any technology? This is out of a review from Wall Street Journal. Telephone took 75 years, okay, since Graham Bell's initial work. The automobile took 64 years for 50 million people to buy it around the world. Electricity took 46 years. Credit cards, 28 years. Television, 22. Automatic teller machine in bank, 18 years. Computers, 14 years. Mobile phones, 12 years. Internet, 7 years. Not that long ago. Many of us will remember in the 1990s when the internet came. Facebook took 4 years. WeChat in China took 1 year. Threads, which Meta started, took 4 days and 6 hours to reach the first 50 million people. So this is the acceleration of the pace of technology, and it's getting faster and faster and faster. So we'll look at some of the implications of this as we move on later. But this sort of shows, of course, the population of the world has increased quite a bit, and the speed of communication has increased quite a bit as well. So from this initial slide, let's go back in history. So the year I want to go to is 1862. So 1862, if you remember American history, between 1860 and 1863-64 was the Civil War in the US, and Abraham Lincoln was the president of the US. So in 1862, when Lincoln was the president, hundreds of thousands of Americans died, killed by other Americans between North and South. The country was falling apart. The president had a lot of things to do, but one of the things he did that completely transformed the innovation ecosystem of the US was to create something called the Morrill Land Grant Act. This is the congressional act that was signed by Abraham Lincoln. And essentially what it did was the government would give land to universities to create public universities that would educate large numbers of people in 2 areas. They didn't call it engineering at that time. They call it technologies and agriculture. So when I first went to the US, I went to a state university called Iowa State University in the middle of the country. In the middle of the campus at Iowa State University is a monument. It was one of the very first universities to be a land-grant university in 1863. So this was created by Lincoln during the Civil War, which is remarkable. And Congress, one of the Congressman Morrill, created this act, and Lincoln signed it into law. So University of California is a land grant, the whole system. Cornell, even though it's a private university, is a land grant university. MIT, even though it's a private university, is a land grant university. University of Michigan, Purdue, Georgia Tech, all the public universities in the US, and they educated millions and millions of Americans in engineering and agriculture. And that completely transformed the educational enterprise of the US. Now, still during the Civil War, but now the year is 1863, the president had a lot of things to do, but he created the US National Academy of Sciences, which is pretty remarkable during war, during internal war. On top of it, what was remarkable was it was created as an independent entity free of government. This is 1863. Congress and the White House at that time had the wisdom to say, we don't want science to be polluted by politics. We want science to be independent. And therefore, the national academies do not get any money from the government. So they are on their own, but the government will ask them, Congress will ask them for advice. If Congress gave them money, if they ask for advice, then they will tell Congress what Congress wants to hear. So they decided, we won't give you money, but you can get money to do projects which could be funded by the government. But you are not part of the government, you are an independent entity, and you advise the Congress. And that worked very well until recently, let's say. And it's been 160 some years. It has worked very well. And again, the wisdom at that time to create an entity that was independent of government influence was quite remarkable. And this happened during the Civil War. Now let's fast forward to right after the Second World War. So in Time magazine in 1945, the cover was Professor Vannevar Bush. Bush was a professor of electrical engineering at MIT. He was the first dean of engineering at MIT. And right after the war, the White House invited him to come to Washington. He was one of the first people also to create a large computer. So they invited him to Washington and asked him to advise on science policy, how to create institutions right after the war so that the US can pick up after the war efforts. So in fact, I was dean of engineering. I literally sat in the same chair that he sat in, but I never met him. He died in 1976 or 77. If you have seen the movie Oppenheimer, there is a congressional inquiry from the Manhattan Project. One of the people invited to testify was Vannevar Bush. And in fact, he's sort of like my academic father or grandfather in the sense I held the Vannevar Bush professorship at MIT for many years. So, but I never met him. So he produced a report called Science, the Endless Frontier, which was a remarkable report. And it had 4 theses, which I'm going to describe in the next slide. And he argued that basic scientific research is essential for the prosperity and safety of a country like US. And therefore, it's the responsibility of the federal government to fund that research, which was pretty revolutionary. It was not the case before the Second World War. So the military funding was from the federal government, but not during civilian research and during peacetime. So like any good idea, he produced a report to the White House. Like any good idea, it was immediately rejected and it was sent back, but he persisted Then in 1950, President Harry Truman accepted the report and created the National Science Foundation. By the time the National Science Foundation was created, he had made enough enemies in Washington. He was never made the first director of NSF. He was also not made the president of MIT because he had enough enemies both in Washington and Boston because he was a visionary individual. But he was made, he was one of the co-founders of Raytheon Corporation, which is a large defense company now. He was also the president of the Carnegie Institution of Science, and he did many other things, and then he passed away in the mid-1970s. So that's the report. This report has had more influence than anything else. This report led to the creation of NSF. It led to the creation indirectly of NIH, NASA, and many other ways in which the US scientific enterprise and scientific policy operates even today. So there is one quote from the report that I want to read. New products and new processes do not appear full grown. They are founded on new principles and new conceptions, which in turn are painstakingly developed by research in the purest realms of science. So he argued that fundamental science is absolutely necessary for the prosperity of a country. So here is a picture taken at the White House. In the middle is President Harry Truman. To the left is Vannevar Bush, and to the right is another advisor, James Conant. So there are four principles in the Science, the Endless Frontier. So here are the four. The first three are non-controversial, but the fourth one was controversial at that time. He argued that the economic prosperity and national security depend on innovation. So everybody would agree to that. Then he argued that the seed for innovation is fundamental research, not applied research, but basic research. And he further argued that industry cannot fund that because they are more driven by immediate profit return and return on investment, and whereas fundamental research takes a very long time. And he also argued that the research is best supported at universities. And the reason is that universities, you have tenured professors who can afford to think long term. And universities also educate young minds who in the future will become government leaders, industry leaders, and policymakers. So you can mold young minds at an early stage by doing research at a university. And then you can have collaboration between university, industry, and government through national labs, etc. So that was his thesis. But this was the most controversial one, the last one. He argued that it is the responsibility of the federal government to support innovation through research. And so NSF was created. The first year annual budget for NSF for the whole country was a few $100,000 in 1950. Today, the budget is about 9.8 billion US dollars. The Chinese were supposed to overtake NSF. I don't think it has happened yet. It'll happen soon. And it's still the largest basic science and engineering funding agency in the world. NIH is 4 times bigger, but NIH focuses primarily on human health and disease, whereas NSF focuses on all branches of science except human diseases, because that's the focus of. There are many, many areas where it has played an important role. For example, when ARPA, now called DARPA, Agency for Advanced Research Projects Agency, they played a role in creating ARPANET, which became the internet. NSF funded all the basic research. So between the 1960s and the 2000s, over a 50-year period, 85% of all the computer science research in all American universities were funded by NSF, with just a few $1 billion for a country of more than 300 million people. Today, NSF funds 200,000 individuals in 2,000 institutions, and it also funds polar programs in the Antarctica and the Arctic Circle. In fact, all of the US operations in both poles, North Pole and South Pole, reported to my office when I was the director. And at that time, there were 51 countries who were signatories to this. So you can see, imagine there is a lot of science diplomacy involved in this. So this was essentially his thesis. So one of the requirements when you're director of NSF, they tell you a few things which you don't know until you actually take the job. On first day, I was told that I couldn't travel on my regular passport. I have to carry, because of all the factors that I just mentioned, I have to carry a US diplomatic passport on any official trip. I can go on my personal trip with my private passport, but not on the official trip. That's one. The second is the NSF director has to testify to Congress 3 times a year, twice to the House and once to the Senate for budget. And every year when I go to testify, I'll be asked the question, you are asking for, when I was director, the budget was $7.4 billion a year. This was right after the 2008 financial crisis. So in 2010, when I went to ask for $7.4 billion, the first question would be, 25 million Americans are unemployed, and you are asking for $7.5 billion of taxpayer money. And what good is your research going to do? What is the return on investment? So I was very prepared, and I could recite it in my sleep. What is the return on investment of the taxpayer investment? Since 1950, when NSF was created, until today, this is the latest number as of this morning, until they announced the next Nobel Prizes in October, 274 NSF-supported Nobel Prize winners since 1950. That's 70% of all the American Nobel Prize winners in all fields were funded by NSF. The Nobel Prize winning work was primarily funded by NSF. And 35% of all the Nobel Prizes in the world since 1950 in all fields were funded by one agency, and it's one of the smallest agencies in Washington. It's 1/4 the size of NIH. There is no other agency on the planet that has produced more Nobel laureates than NSF. So this was my first point. Now, the return on the investment, look at every Nobel Prize, the technology that it created, the industries that it created, the applications that it created, the economic value of that return runs in the billions of dollars. So this is the return on investment. So 82 in physics, 70 in chemistry, 73 in economics. They even have had funded Peace Prize winners who did research in some other areas. So the other is industry applications. When in the 1970s, Congress decided to create small business innovation research, or SBIR programs, because small businesses account for 50% of all the jobs created in the country. So they could have put it in the Department of Commerce. They could have put it somewhere else. They didn't do it. They put it at the National Science Foundation because of the connection between basic research and innovation and creation of jobs and benefit to the society. So the first agency to have the small business innovation research are STTR, small business technology transfer programs, were housed at NSF. Now all the agencies have them. So take a large company like Qualcomm that makes the chips for mobile phones. When Qualcomm was a startup in San Diego in the 1960s, the founders needed $25,000. It was called Linkabit before it was called Qualcomm. The founders needed $25,000 to survive. They were running out of money. They went, the venture community in Silicon Valley did not exist at that time. So they asked NSF, can you help us with $25,000? NSF gave $25,000. Symantec, another famous company in Silicon Valley, needed some money to survive. NSF gave 25,000. So I have founders of all of these companies on a videotape telling that without the $25,000, they wouldn't exist today. So now these are well over $100 billion market cap companies. So there are many, many others like this. Then there are grand challenges, addressing grand challenges from climate change to, so for example, at the South Pole, we have a 10-meter telescope to do physics research. We also do research, a lot of research on climate change. In Greenland, in north central Greenland, there's a place called Summit where Denmark and the US had a center to drill into the ice several kilometers to study climate change. So these were all the polar programs. I don't know what the numbers are now. When I was director, the South Pole, the Antarctica program was $400 million a year in budget. And the Arctic program was about $30 to $40 million a year. It's probably more today. And then ALMA, Atacama Large Millimeter Array Telescope in Chile, in the Atacama Desert. I went to the opening of the array in 2013. LIGO. So again, another success story. Einstein's predictions on gravitational waves was proved because of the funding. In fact, I remember I was given a very hard time by some congressman why I was wasting taxpayer money on some frivolous research, which had a lot of noise than signal. And in the end, it won a Nobel Prize not that long ago. Polar program, so both the North Pole and the South Pole program. Science for diplomacy and diplomacy for science. So just the South Pole, for example, had 51 signatories. If anybody wanted to go to the South Pole, they could not go without signature from NSF because the military plane has to take. And we owned, or we leased 4 airplanes from the US Air Force. So we had to sign off on anybody, congressman, White House, anybody has to go through NSF. So it played a very important role. And I was talking to John earlier that during the Cold War, when there was hardly any communication between State Department and foreign ministers in different countries, especially the former Soviet Union, NSF had a way to communicate with scientists in ways in which that was not possible diplomatically. And that's a very important role. Unfortunately, we are at a point where it's worse now than it was during the Cold War in terms of communication, science communication. Human talent development. So we used to give 2,000 graduate fellowships every year. So top students in university, graduate students across all across the US, we gave 2,000 scholarships for 4 years. These are very prestigious NSF graduate fellowships. Last year, the new administration cut it from 2,000 to 1,000. So these are the people who become future leaders in science. One of the people we supported in the 1990s at Stanford with an NSF graduate fellowship was born in Russia, but moved to the US, was Sergey Brin. And Sergey Brin's PhD thesis at Stanford, called the PageRank method, was the intellectual property that led to the creation of Google with Larry Page. And Google is now a $3.5 trillion company. And the first IP was funded by the National Science Foundation in the 90s to a Russian immigrant in the US. It's pretty remarkable. We had, and there are many, many stories like this. And we also had, when I was director, we signed an agreement with the European Union called the Implementation Agreement. Essentially, the idea was NSF will select young, talented faculty members in American universities. We'll do all the selection process based on peer review and various panels. And we signed an agreement with the EU that these people, if they want to come, they can pick any one of the 27 countries in the European Union, and EU would fund them to spend anywhere from 3 months to 1 year in any institution that gets ERC funding in Europe. Unfortunately, there are not many takers from the US. So I went to Dublin in Ireland and signed an agreement with the EU commissioner. Now there are 15 such implementation agreements. India, China, many countries have signed the agreement. Switzerland, many countries have signed the agreement. Many are doing well, but unfortunately, there are not that many people going from US to Europe. And Europe is providing funding for these people to come. So these are the kinds of things that NSF was very, very good at. And then multi-sector partnerships, so between academia, industry, and government. One of the remarkable things about NSF is that our budget was $7.4 billion a year when I was director. Now it's about 9 point something. But the overhead rate was 5.8%. So for every $1 you get from the government, 5.8% of $1, which is 5.8 cents, was the overhead. The rest goes back. So that's one. Unlike NASA, Department of Energy, or NIH, there is no internal research at NSF. So all the money that comes in goes out. And then we had, at that time, about 430 program officers, scientific program officers. And we thought that if all of them were government employees, 100% throughout their career, they wouldn't be able to do research. So if you don't do research, you cannot be an effective selector of research funding. So we had a model that half of the employees were government employees, but half were professors from universities who would come for 2 to 3 years. And we would pay the university the salary of the professor for those 3 years, and we would allow them to do research 1 day a week. They can go back, do research. And this kept a dynamic process that would help keep at the cutting edge and engage different people to come and do research work and select research projects through a peer review process. So I mentioned Abraham Lincoln in terms of leadership. I mentioned Harry Truman, President Harry Truman, who signed the law into an NSF, to create NSF, accepting Vannevar Bush's report, Science, the Endless Frontier. Now, I just also want to point out, policies matter. Before the Second World War, before 1935 or so, Germany, UK, and France each produced more Nobel laureates than the US, each one of them. But 10 years after the Second World War, the US produced more Nobel laureates, more American Nobel laureates. A lot of them were immigrants from Europe who became American citizens. The US produced more Nobel laureates than Germany, France, and UK combined. And that hasn't changed over the last 75 years. The US has dominated because of Vannevar Bush's vision and policy, and that was accepted. So I mentioned President Lincoln. I also mentioned President Truman. Now let me mention President Kennedy. So Kennedy, as you know, in 1963, created the Moonshot Project, and I'll let him describe. So it's wonderful to have a president who is so eloquent. so, so, so Neil Armstrong did land on the moon on July 20th, 1969. So when I was at NSF, people would ask, cite this. So that one project from 1962, 1963 to 1969 galvanized so many people to go into science because they were fascinated by going to moon, space program, and things like this. So when I was at NSF, they would ask, why, you have a large budget. Why are you funding $30,000 to a 25-year-old mathematician to do something all alone sitting in a room by himself or herself? Why don't you fund moonshot projects? Why are you wasting money on little things? So I want to answer that. That's a very important question. We didn't want to do that for a reason. And here is the reason. So Neil Armstrong did go to the moon. So Kennedy's promise, even though Kennedy was killed, was fulfilled. And it did happen. And not only that, 3 years ago, India sent the Chandrayaan probe to the south side of moon with home-built technology for the first time. It's much more difficult than to go where Neil Armstrong went. And somebody made a joke that India spent less money sending the probe all the way to the south side of the moon than Hollywood spent money on a movie about going to the moon. So this is what I call frugal innovation. So innovation can be very expensive, or in some places it can be very frugal. Of course, India benefited a lot from what was learned from NASA's programs, and a lot of the top Indian scientists in particular had connections to JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab in California and at Caltech, and many of the leaders had connections to Caltech. So Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, but somebody made a comment that we put Armstrong on the moon before we put wheels on a suitcase. Right? So suitcases have been around for a very long time. Wheels have been around for a very, very long time. Nobody thought of putting a wheel. So many of you will remember we used to carry the suitcases without wheels. And when did that happen? That happened after Neil Armstrong went to the moon. Okay? So the first patent to put a wheel on a suitcase, the roller board, was filed in 1970 in Massachusetts by somebody who was an airline pilot. And the patent was issued in 1972. So this is my answer to the moonshot questions. Ideas come in different flavors. There are big ideas, there are small ideas. Sometimes the small ideas are much more useful on Earth for hundreds of millions of people than going to the moon. Because without a wheeled suitcase, what will we do today? So it's pretty remarkable. And this is why it's very important to support a young scientist working alone with one idea in an office can change the world. And historically, when you look at Nobel Prizes and many other inventions, this has played a very important role. So I want to come to the introduction. I want to come to more recent history. So I want to give one case study of a program that we created at NSF. It's called the I-Core program, Innovation Core program, like Peace Corps. So this is a younger version of me, 15 years ago. And sitting in the middle is Dr. John Holdren, who's the science advisor to the US president.
He hasn't changed at all.
Exactly. And sitting next to him is Carl Wyman, who won the Nobel Prize in 2001 for the Bose-Einstein condensate. He was a deputy to John Holdren at that time. So we announced the I-Core program in July of 2011 and started this in 2012. Now, what does this program do? So typically, people get a 3 to 5 year grant from NSF. Typically, for 3 years, it's about $500,000. Everybody publishes papers. Many people file for patents. But most of the ideas don't go anywhere. So they just get forgotten. Few places like Stanford or MIT, they have a very good technology transfer enterprise. So they can take the ideas, their offices can help the faculty and students to go beyond publishing papers. But there are large numbers of universities where there are no technology transfer offices. So we thought, how do we extract more value out of taxpayer money? So we'll set up. So out of a $7.4 billion budget, I set aside just a couple of $1 million. So it's a very small amount. If it completely fails, it's not consequential. So the idea was this. So you don't do new research. You do your research with NSF funding. Near the end of that funding, you write a one-page proposal to NSF and ask for $50,000. So NSF usually took a long time to review anything. So I had to change the internal process. So we decided if you send a one-page proposal within 4 weeks, we will let you know whether you get the money or not. So if you get the money, you get $50,000 and you have 6 months. You're not supposed to do new research, but you use the money to see if the research that you have already done has a chance of succeeding beyond a publication. So one of the requirements for accepting our $50,000 is you have to go to a boot camp for 3 days. And professors don't like to be lectured at by somebody else. And in the boot camp, we would have venture capitalists, CTOs, CEOs come and tell the professors and the students, so, okay, you have a great idea, so what? What do you do with it? And initially, there was a lot of negative reaction to this, but it has become one of the most successful programs. At the end of 6 months, if you say, my idea was great, I'm going to start a company and I'm going to grow this, then we say, good luck to you. We supported you. You've done well. Good luck. Go on your own. If you say, I failed completely, my idea has no opportunity, no chance of succeeding, we say, well done. You have tried. Good for you. You learned something in the process. Good luck to you. Whatever you do, maybe next time you'll be successful. Either way, we have nothing to do with it beyond that. So that's the goal of this project. So in little more than 10 years after we created this in 2012, here is the return on investment. So how well has this program done in 12 years? It is still the only thing that Republicans and Democrats can agree on in the House to support ICOR. They don't agree on anything else. So it was announced in 2011 and launched in 2012. NIH created a similar program called the Health Core. ARPA-E, Energy, created an Energy Core. The Science Foundation of Ireland created a program similar to this. Singapore created a program called Lean Launchpad, which is essentially ICOR. Australia, universities in India, IIT Madras has a similar program, and so forth. So what is the return on investment? In 1 decade after 2012, 2,500 startup companies were created in the US in all 50 states. So Mississippi as a company, as does Massachusetts and Silicon Valley. Nearly $5 billion in external funding. This includes NSF, NIH, and ARPA-E. And it has trained more than 3,000 teams, and half of the team members are women. It's a pretty remarkable result. So as a result of this, the program has become, so we started with $2 million a year. Now it's $70 million a year. So it has really grown quite a bit. So I mentioned leadership matters. So I come to the next president. And one of the remarkable things about working with this president, despite the fact he was a lawyer, he had so much interest in science, and he was exceptionally supportive to the point. In 3 years, I had the opportunity to meet him in the Oval Office 7 times. And it's pretty amazing. And my successors, since I left office in 2013, 3 of my successors have not met the president once, any president once. So just to show you how leadership matters. So the Indian government, about 2 years ago, created a new agency called the Anusandhan National Research Foundation, ANRF. And it is still in the very early stages, and it has its own CEO, and it has a governing board that's chaired by Prime Minister Modi. And the vision, it's not yet complete. The vision is to create an enterprise in India that sort of models itself on successful science policy enterprises, such as the National Science Foundation in the US. And they're looking at many other models as well, including European models. So I want to summarize a couple of quick things and then make some comments about the future. What are the ingredients of a successful innovation ecosystem? Absolutely necessary global talent attraction. So one of the reasons the US had been the unquestionable leader in innovation since the Second World War has been it can pretty much get anybody from anywhere in the world to come to the US, perhaps until recently, and which is remarkable. So let's think about it from an economics point of view. Studies show that if a child is born today in the US, it takes the parents roughly $500,000 to raise the child on average, public school, private school, whatever it is, from birth to age 22 when the child graduates from university, $500,000. So there was a proposal to attract 100,000 top students from all over the world to American universities and give them a green card. So you think about this, 100,000 students, top students from France, China, India, Japan, come to the US, go to university at age 22 to graduate school. Some other taxpayer has already paid the $500,000 to raise the child to age 22. They come to the US, they get a graduate degree, they get a green card, they stay in the US. That means the rest of the world is subsidizing the US innovation ecosystem to the tune of $500,000 per person. So 100,000 times $500,000 is $50 billion, which is 7 times the annual budget of the National Science Foundation. So my argument to Congress was if you attract 100,000 smart people from all over the world to come, you are essentially getting 7 times my budget from the rest of the world to subsidize the American innovation ecosystem. Why wouldn't you do it? Of course, they didn't do it. Just because you asked, they wouldn't do it. So that's that's very important. This is where China has not quite caught up with the US. And I think there is an opportunity for Europe right now, but individual countries in Europe cannot do it. It has to be collectively on a scale that the US can do. Diversity of people and ideas. Again, people from all over the world who have very different life experiences, different cultures, different languages, different customs. They look at the same problem through different lenses, and therefore they come up with different solutions. This is why Silicon Valley is so successful. You have people from everywhere. Abundant versus frugal innovation. Many of these people come from countries where there is frugal innovation. Great ideas can come from anyone. So it's not just the privileged. Anybody can come up with a great idea. That's the spirit of NSF I-Core. But just provide opportunities to them, provide access to them. And multi-sector interaction, so you have an opportunity to leapfrog. So let me just finish in the next 7 minutes or so with a few thoughts. So this is the past to the present. Now let's look to the future. There's a lot of discussion about technology, science policy, and society. And the biggest question with respect to AI is how will humanity be affected by AI in the next 10 years, 15 years, whatever it may be. So all these human qualities, will they be affected? Because machines are making the decisions and machines don't have the same sensitivity that you and I do. Even people from the same family, brothers and sisters can be very different because of the individual characteristics which the machines don't have. So I want to give you 2 examples of why this matters. First is intended benefits and unintended consequences. So in the year 2000, the US National Academy of Engineering commissioned a study called 20 Greatest Advancements of the 20th Century, Engineering Advancements, Electrification, Commercial Aviation, Creation of Nuclear Power, Creation of the Internet, Automotive Assembly Lines, Microchips, etc., all the things we know. Then 4 years later, the same National Academy of Engineering in Washington put together a distinguished committee and said, what are the grand challenges for the 21st century? The grand challenges were containing nuclear terror, containing pollution, saving the planet, securing cyberspace. So this is my personal opinion. If you put the 2 lists side by side, the 20 greatest achievements of the 20th century and the 14 grand challenges of the 21st century, you cannot help but wonder whether the 14 grand challenges are a direct consequence of the 20 greatest achievements of the 20th century. If so, here is the question. If we were so smart in the last century as engineers, scientists, to come up with all these wonderful inventions, and in the process unintentionally created all these problems for the future generations, how likely is it that we're going to be that much smarter in the 21st century and try to solve the grand challenges, but not create new challenges for the 22nd century? So what was missing? I think what was missing, perhaps, again, there is no consensus on this, is that nobody really thought about the full picture. For example, when Ford and General Motors wanted to sell cars, they made sure that there was no public transportation in the US, not as good as Europe. So gasoline prices were very low, automotives were very cheap, tax on cars were low, tax on petrol was cheap. As a result, public transportation never had a chance to succeed. So now you look at climate change and pollution and traffic jams and things like this, you wonder whether that was the right policy. So how do you take into account the full picture in a way that we have not done in the last century? Of course, Europe has made other mistakes in other areas, but governments in general, how do they take the full picture into account? The other example I want to show with respect to AI, so this is a true story. This is taken from a BBC website on 9th of March 2019. So in California at Kaiser Permanente Hospital, there was a man who was admitted to the hospital, and a doctor was not there in the hospital. The doctor did telemedicine. So he spoke to the patient online, and the patient had some tests done. The doctor diagnosed them remotely, came up with a very precise prognosis for the patient. He said, "You have terminal cancer. I'll give you between 2 weeks and 2 months to live. And unfortunately, there's nothing that can be done." And he was accurate. Unfortunately, he delivered the message to the patient online. There was nobody in the room. The patient was alone, and the patient died a couple of days later. So the diagnosis was accurate, but there was no humanity, absolutely no humanity in this. So this is a very good example of technology without humanity. Um, uh, uh, and this is likely to get worse if we are not careful with policy, with technology. And this is a real story. I won't go into the details. I'll just list my own personal take on 6 issues with AI. Job creation versus job destruction. So in Industry 4.0, as in the previous 3 industries, we know from the 3 previous industrial revolutions that a lot of jobs were destroyed. But many more jobs were created than were destroyed. But it took 20 to 30-year gap before the new jobs were created. Now, with the speed of innovation that I showed you in the first slide, nobody has the patience to wait 30 years. So what we don't know is the time lag between job creation and job destruction. If it is more than a year or 2, there will be revolutions. Governments will change. There'll be public revolt in all the countries. Unfortunately, that's what we face. With AI, what is the definition of an educated person? So if you have 4 years of college and you get a university degree, what is the minimum body of knowledge that you're supposed to possess? So some people would argue at MIT, for example, there is a lot of discussion. You want to be able to think quantitatively. You want to be able to think probabilistically. You want to know a certain minimum amount of mathematics and physics and chemistry, etc. You want to know economics, and you want to know probability and statistics, and you want to have good communication skills, and you want to be able to adapt and be able to work in a team. Once you have that and you're an average smart person, you should be able to succeed, and you can change professions, you can change jobs quite frequently. But what do you teach in 4 years to get that? No university has yet figured it out. What is the definition of being human? what is the minimum characteristics, and who decides how to program the machines to come up with uh, uh, large language models or whatever it is that will come up with this. Then the course of the issue of singularity, will it happen? Will it happen in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Will machine decisions be reversible by humans? Will machine decisions be reversible by humans just in time before a catastrophic event happens? And will machines worsen intrinsic human bias, or will they make it better? And indications are that if the machine knows human bias and fed the data, it'll be much worse than humans in terms of bias. Intended benefits and unintended consequences, and we saw an example of that I gave earlier. The last one is very subtle. So one of the characteristics of being human is you're not always punctual, you're not always correct, you fail and you learn. And what technology is doing now, especially AI, is forces us to be faster and faster, more and more precise, more and more immediate, with little time for reflection and with little time to learn from mistakes. So as we are pushed more and more, the impatience level gets higher and higher, and that goes counter to creativity. So you want time to reflect so that you can be creative. So will it affect? We don't know. So will it affect our creativity in the long run? If the attention span of those who grew up in the social media age, because they're always looking at their phone, is very small, then what kind of world will we live in 20 years from now, 30 years from now? If you're an optimist, will say humans are always smart, they'll figure it out. If you're an optimist, you'll say the next generation will be smarter than just this generation. If you're a pessimist, you'll say nothing like the good old days. So truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And I finish with the demographic time bomb. So this is something I never thought of until very recently. So here is an experiment. The world population is about 8.2 to 8.5 billion. India has a population of 1.5 billion. I'm going to look at just the number of school children, K through 12 school children in the world. It's about 1.5 billion all over the world. Now you look at the 3 most populous countries in the world. India has a population of 1.5 billion. 20% or 290 million school children in India, K through 12. Their mean age is 12. Their age between 6 and 18. Their average age is 12. There are 290 million school children in India that are known. There are more that are unknown, unaccounted for, right? So if the school children of India were a separate country by itself, it'll be the 3rd most populous country in the world, setting aside India, after China and the US. So the country of school children of India, which 20 years from now will be at the peak of their career, will be 30 years from now, is the 3rd most populous country in the world. So if we're sitting in Davos or Switzerland or Geneva or Boston or Silicon Valley talking about the future of education, these 90 million children don't have a seat at the table. By 2070, there will be 700 million K through 12 children in Africa, all of Africa, 700 million. They definitely don't have a seat at the table. So when we look to the future of the world, 20 years from now, 40 years from now, 50 years from now, the people who will be impacted by this and the people who will be at the center of the world, experiencing all the consequences, currently don't have a voice in the conversation. It's a very interesting place to think. So this is an actual classroom. This was in Forbes magazine. It's in the state of Andhra Pradesh in India. And in fact, there is a company called SchoolNet in New Delhi that makes technology using AI. You can project it on any wall. It's a box that's powered by a battery. And as long as you have a Wi-Fi connection, You can access any internet, any large language model, and it can teach you from mathematics to language, and it can do it in any language that you want, which is especially important for a country like India with a lot of languages. And these children, this is the size of the classroom. They're sitting under a banyan tree, and this is where the vast majority of the future inhabitants of the world are going to come from. And so I asked ChatGPT to tell me what the future of the class, this is the current classroom, okay? I asked ChatGPT to tell me what the future classroom is going to look like. Here is an image. I would rather be sitting under the banyan tree, to be honest. So it's this is a large language model vision of what a future classroom will look like. So this is my last slide. This is a paper that was just published a few months ago by Oxford University Press. It's a very complicated figure. So let me explain. What is plotted in the vertical axis is fraction of the population in any region. That is the working age population. The working age population is defined as between age 16 and 64. Okay? So Europe, the world, India, and Africa, those are the 4 regions. So if you look at Europe, which is the blue line, Europe peaked in 2012, 2013. 68.3% of European population was working age population. Now it's in decline. It's a very rapid decline, you can see. By 2100, it'll be 54%. World, which is the gray curve, it also peaked around 2013. The world working age population is also declining slowly. India is at its peak right now. And that's why it's the fastest growing large economy with a 7% GDP growth. It's at 68.9% around now, between now and 2030 or so. But it'll start to decline, and it'll decline very rapidly in the next 30, 40 years. But if you look to 2070, 2075, Africa will be at the peak. And so this one graph tells us where not only I showed you the K through 12 students, what they learn will determine the future of the world, and where the largest populations of school children are, and also the working age population and how that will shift between 1950 and 2100, 150-year period. And this is the demographic trend that we are facing. So given this, how do we address the future of the world, whether it's climate change, whether it's AI, etc.? What opportunities do you give, and how do you take into account? So I serve on the board of something called the Villard Institute in Switzerland, and it's a think tank that works on biodiversity, climate change, as well as future of education. But again, the discussions we've had in the boardroom is that it's one thing to sit in the Swiss Alps and talk about the future of the world. So the number of school teachers in India is 10 million, which is the same as the population of Switzerland or Austria. The number of school teachers, K through 12 teachers, is 10 million in India. So how do you engage them in the conversation? Africa is going to be even more critical. So I'll stop here with this graph because it gives us a lot to think about the future. Thank you.